My name is Elara Vance, and for 30 years, I believed my family saw me as more than a line item. That lie shattered the moment I woke from a coma to learn my father, Alistair, had told doctors to let me die to save money. He even signed a DNR. What happens when your entire life is built on a foundation of deceit? In just 5 weeks, I discovered he'd forged my professional certification, leveraged our whole company on it, and thought I'd never find out. He stood on a stage, beaming, about to cut a ribbon at the grand opening of his flagship project, the mayor and bank reps watching. He was so sure he'd won. He had no idea the truth was already in their hands, delivered hours before he lifted those ceremonial shears. Before we get into this, please take a moment to like and subscribe. But only if this story truly resonates with you. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know where you are right now. My name is Elara Vance, and I was 30 the day my father stood in a hospital and told a doctor to let me die. Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery. He sat 3 feet from my bed while I lay in a coma and couldn't answer him. He signed a do not resuscitate order to save money. He was so sure that was the end of me. He had no idea it was the end of him. 3 days later, I opened my eyes. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. I spent 5 quiet weeks getting everything in order. Then I made one phone call, and 24 hours later, everything my father had built for 30 years was simply gone. But here's the part none of them remembered while they were doing the math on my life. There was one signature in that whole company my father had spent 4 years pretending was his. It was mine. Welcome back to Sunken Secrets, where quiet people keep the ledgers and justice shows up on official letterhead. If anyone in your life has ever sat down and calculated whether you were worth the cost, this story is for you. You already know the feeling I'm about to describe. Drop a comment below, and be sure to subscribe because what my family did next still doesn't feel real when I say it out loud. The first thing I felt was the wristband before the light, before the beeping, before I understood that the dryness in my throat was a tube they just pulled. There was a plastic band around my left wrist, and it was the wrong color. I'd worked enough dockyards and refit bays to know color codes mean something, and some animal part of my brain knew this crimson was bad before the rest of me caught up. A nurse came in and stopped dead in the doorway. She was maybe 50, name tag, reading Sophia Morales. And the look on her face was not the look you give a patient who's supposed to be improving. It was the look you give a ghost. "You're awake," she said very carefully, like the words might break me. I tried to speak and produced a sound like gravel. She crossed the room fast, checked the monitor, then took a small pair of scissors from her pocket. "Hold still, honey." And she cut the crimson band off my wrist and folded it into her palm like it was evidence. I watched her do it. I didn't know yet what the band meant, but I knew she wanted it gone before anyone else walked in. "What is that?" I managed. Sophia looked at the doorway, then back at me. "Something that should never have been on you," she said. "We're going to talk about it, but not until the doctor's here." She slipped the band into her pocket. My heart was doing 70 on a monitor that beeped for everyone to hear, and the only thing I could think lying there was a single cold question I couldn't answer. Why had somebody decided I was supposed to die? The doctor came an hour later, a tired man named Dr. Chin, who explained things in the flat voice of someone who'd had this conversation before and hated it. There had been a boating accident, internal bleeding. I'd needed emergency surgery, and I'd been sedated and unresponsive for 3 days. That part one could accept. What I couldn't accept came next when Sophia stayed by the door, and Dr. Chin chose his words like he was stepping across a frozen pond. "When you arrived, a family member refused to consent to the surgery you needed. He said he identified himself as your medical decision-maker, and he asked us to make you a do not resuscitate, so that if your heart stopped on the table, we'd let you go instead of bringing you back." I asked who. Sophia's jaw tightened before the doctor even answered. "Your father." I lay still and let that sink in like cold water through a coat. Then Sophia said the thing she'd clearly been carrying for 3 days, the words she'd heard him say in this very room. She repeated them to me exactly, because she thought I deserved to know exactly. He had looked at the surgeon with me dying on the table, and he had said, "Let her go. We won't pay for the surgery." 9 words. I have replayed them more times than I can count, and they never get smaller. My father did not say he couldn't bear to see me suffer. He did not say he was scared. He talked about the bill. Dr. Chen cleared his throat. We didn't honor either decision.
I want to be clear about that.
There's a process, and his authority didn't survive it.
Inådde like you understood.
I didn't.
Not yet.
But I understood enough to know my family thought I was already gone. You should know who I am, because it matters for everything that comes after. I'm a maritime surveyor. I have a certification, which means the state of Florida trusts me to sign off on a vessel's seaworthiness, and people get to believe me. I earned that the slow way. No one paid my tuition. I worked summers as a deckhand on charter boats to cover community college, transferred to a state school, and sat for the exam twice before I passed. To this day, the smell of salt and diesel takes me straight back to a dock at 6 o'clock in the morning. Oil in my hair, learning how real things get built by men who didn't talk much and respected me only after I outworked them. I loved it. I still do. I'm not loud. My friends would tell you I read contracts the way other people read their horoscopes, looking for the clause that's going to ruin my week. That carefulness is why my father came to me 4 years ago after his own main certification was gone and asked me to be the financial advisor of record for the family firm, Vance Marine Holdings. He framed it as a favor, a bridge, a temporary thing until he sorted himself out. 40 men had jobs there. I said yes. I want you to understand that I said yes with my eyes open, knowing exactly what my signature meant on paper. What I didn't know is that a man who would forge a feeling in his own daughter's eulogy would have no trouble at all forging the rest. The favor I did out of duty was about to become the only thing standing between my father and ruin. Let me introduce the rest of them. My father, Alistair Vance, 61. A big handsome man who could shake your hand at the yacht club and make you feel chosen. My mother, Eleanor, 58, who never raised her voice because she never had to. She did her damage in a register only the family could hear. And my younger brother Marcus, 28, who held the title of VP of Operations at a company he couldn't have run for a week. Growing up, the money flowed one direction toward Marcus, and the bills flowed the other toward me. I had a long hospital stay as a kid. Asthma, nothing dramatic, but expensive. And my mother never let me forget the number. At my cousin's wedding when I was 19, she told a table of relatives with a soft little laugh. She was always the costly one. Everyone chuckled. I didn't. I have carried that sentence for 11 years. And lying in that hospital bed, I finally understood it wasn't a joke. It was an accounting.
So here are the stakes. Plain.
If I did nothing, the DNR would be buried as a misunderstanding. A panicked father in a hard moment. And I'd still be legally chained to a company run by the people who just tried to round me down to zero. If you're watching this and you've ever been the line item in your own family's budget, the one whose worth got debated out loud, then you know the exact temperature of the air in that room. Stay with me because I promise the part where it turns is worth it. Comment the word costly if you've ever been called a cost by someone who is supposed to love you for free. And subscribe because the favor I did my father was about to come due, and not the way he expected. I keep going back to the morning of the accident because of where I was driving. The firm's flagship job was a mixed-use marina development called Anchor's Edge, new slips, luxury retail, apartments above, the kind of project that puts a small marine company on the map or under the ground. I had questions about it. Specifically, I had asked twice for the open contract list and gotten nothing. And that morning, I decided to drive out and look at the site myself with a folder of paperwork on my passenger seat that I meant to reconcile against the county records. I never got there. A delivery truck ran the light at Coral and Main doing 50, and the next thing my body knew was a hospital. It took 3 days to wake up inside. The surgery they wanted to perform, the one my father refused to pay for, was to stop the bleeding in my abdomen. It was not heroic experimental medicine. It was the standard thing you do so a healthy 30-year-old doesn't die of something fixable. That's what he weighed against money. That's what came up short on his scale. They did the surgery anyway, and they kept me sedated while my body knit itself back together. And the whole time I was under, the folder from my passenger seat sat in an evidence bag in a property room waiting. I didn't know it was waiting.
I didn't know any of it yet.
All I knew, 3 days in, was that the people who shared my last name had looked at my unconscious face, and decided the math didn't work. The math, it turned out, was about to get a lot more complicated. Sophia came back that night when the floor was quiet and told me how I'd survived because she figured I'd want the truth from someone who was there. When my father refused to consent and asked them to make me a DNR, he told the surgical team he was my healthcare agent and that I had no one else. That was a lie, but a useful one in a chaotic ER. What he didn't count on was Sophia. She'd asked for documentation, the proxy form, the directive, anything. And he didn't have it because it didn't exist. A grown adult who can recover doesn't get a stranger's verbal say so honored over her own life. She escalated it. The hospital's ethics committee got pulled in within the hour, and the answer came back fast. Without valid legal authority and without any directive from me. Neither his refusal nor the DNR had any standing. And the physician's duty was to treat. So they treated. I lived because a nurse I'd never met refused to take my father at his word. Sit with that for a second. The people who raised me wanted me gone. And a woman who'd known me for 90 minutes fought to keep me here. He gave the money reason out loud, Sophia said, folding her arms loudly in front of 3 witnesses. People don't usually say the quiet part that clearly unless they've already made peace with it. I asked her what she meant. She shrugged, but it wasn't a careless shrug. In my experience, when somebody's that comfortable letting a person die over a bill, it's almost never really about the bill. That sentence kept me up the rest of the night. Money was the reason he'd given the world. I would spend the next month learning the reason he hadn't. My father came on the 4th day, and the performance was flawless. He filled the doorway with a bouquet too big for the room, and his eyes were wet on cue. "My girl," he said loud enough for the nurse's station to hear. "My girl is back." He hugged me, and I felt nothing move in my chest except a careful watching stillness. My mother arrived behind him with a second arrangement and arranged her face into relief. They were good. If I hadn't heard Sophia's account, if I hadn't seen the crimson band on my own wrist, I might have believed it. People in the hall smiled at the devoted family. I lay there and catalogued the gap between what they were showing the floor and what I knew they had said when they thought no one was charting it. Then my father did the thing that ended any doubt. He pulled a chair close, lowered his voice to the register reserved for family business, and slid a clipboard onto my blanket. "Just some hospital paperwork, sweetheart, so we can handle the billing and insurance while you rest." I looked at the top sheet. It was a consent and authorization form, the kind that hands someone else the keys to your affairs. He had a pen ready. 4 days awake from a coma, and the first thing my father wanted was my signature. "I'll read it when my head clears," I said, and set it on the side table out of his reach. Something flickered across his face, gone in a blink. The look of a man who'd expected a door to open and found it locked. "Of course," he said, smiling. "No rules." There was a rush. I could feel it. I just didn't know yet what was chasing him. By the 6th day, I could sit up and hold a laptop. And a body healing from surgery does a lot of lying still, which leaves the mind free to work. So I worked from the hospital bed. I sent a calm, dated, written request to the firm's office manager for the full list of open refit contracts and loan guarantees on every active Vance Marine Holdings job with a financial advisor of record name on each. Polite, professional, the kind of email that's really a paper trail wearing business casual. The reply came from Marcus, not the office manager, which told me something by itself. "Hey sis, so glad you're okay. The system's mid-upgrade right now. Going to be a couple weeks before we can pull clean records. Don't stress about work. Just heal." 3 exclamation points per sentence, which is how my brother sounds when he's nervous. Contract records don't go offline for an upgrade. They live at the bank and with the clients, not on his laptop, and any first-year clerk can print them. I read his message 4 times, and then I did what careful people do. I saved it. I screenshotted it. I forwarded it to my personal email with a timestamp. I didn't accuse anyone of anything because you don't pull a thread until you know where it's stitched. They discharged me on the 10th day with a walker I was too stubborn to use past the parking lot and a list of restrictions that included no driving until cleared. My father offered to take me to his house in Palm Beach Gardens to be looked after. I told him I'd recover better in my own space, in my condo in Jupiter, 30 minutes from all of them. He didn't argue, but he didn't like it. Distance, I was learning, was going to be the whole game. Home was quiet in the way that lets you hear yourself think. I spent the first week in my own bed, mostly sleeping, but I made one phone call that changed the shape of everything. Leo, a state registrar at the Florida Department of Marine Commerce, was someone I'd worked with for years. The kind of professional acquaintance who knows your coffee order and your certification number. I called to ask gently where the Anchor's Edge loan guarantee documents stood. "Oh, those closed out the financial review last month," he said, friendly. No idea, he was handing me a live wire. "Your certification's right on the latest submittal set. Looks good." I held the phone very still. "My certification," I repeated.
"Sure," he said.
"Financial advisor of record, Elara Vance, certified." "Same as always." I thanked him, hung up, and sat on the edge of my bed for a long minute. Because last month, the entire month he was talking about, I was either in a coma or learning to walk to a hospital bathroom. I had not certified anything. I had not reviewed a single sheet. I got up slow and careful with the stitches and went to my desk drawer where I keep my surveyor's seal, the physical embosser with my certification number cut into the die. It was exactly where I'd left it, untouched, cold metal in my hand. Whatever stamp Leo was looking at on that submittal set, it hadn't come from this, which meant someone had made another one. Someone had put my professional certification, the thing I'd sat for twice and bled for, onto documents I'd never seen, while I was unconscious in a bed my father wanted to turn off. I didn't feel rage yet. Maritime surveyors don't start with rage. We start with where exactly is the stress coming from. Here's the part one needs you to understand, because it's the part where a smart woman looks trapped and isn't stupid. 5 months before the accident, I had already tried to get out. I'd grown uneasy watching how loose the firm had gotten with process, and I'd filed the formal paperwork to withdraw as financial advisor of record. I did the responsible thing the responsible way. And I learned the hard way that you can't just walk off a bonded project overnight. There's a formal way to withdraw as financial advisor of record. You give written notice and follow the process. But on a job like Anchor's Edge, the surety's terms and the owner's contract required a qualified replacement financial advisor to be named and to accept the role before I could cleanly step away. Otherwise, I'd be abandoning an active bonded project and taking the liability onto myself. You don't do that. So, you wait for the replacement. So, my withdrawal sat in limbo, waiting on a replacement my father swore he was actively recruiting. Month after month, the search dragged. There was always a candidate who fell through, a salary they couldn't quite meet, a timeline that slipped. I see it clearly now. He wasn't failing to find my replacement. He was making sure he never did, because my name on that certification was load-bearing for the whole company. And a man drowning in leverage doesn't kick away the thing, keeping his head up. I'd noticed the danger. I'd acted on it. I'd documented every stalled month in writing. And still I was stuck. Not because I trusted him, but because the structure itself had me pinned. That's the cruelest kind of trap. The legal kind. The one you can see and still can't climb out of. What I didn't realize yet was that the trap had a door my father had forgotten he'd left me the key to. Marcus showed up at my condo 2 weeks after I got home, uninvited, with a coffee. He knew I didn't drink and a nervousness he couldn't hide. He paced my small living room and got to the point faster than he meant to. "Look, Elara, about the firm, work stuff. You know how the state is." Then he said the thing that lit the whole board for me, because Marcus has never in his life been able to hold a fact he was proud of. "Look, the whole company's riding on Anchor's Edge closing on time. Dad put all the firm's liquidity into it. The construction financing, the credit lines, all of it's tied to that project. If the bank gets spooked, we're sunk. So just sign, okay?" I kept my face neutral and my voice soft. The way you talk to someone standing too close to an edge. "I need to see the original loan guarantee documents before I put my name on anything," I said. "The actual sheets. That's not negotiable for any certified advisor."
He didn't like that.
"Why does it have to be a whole thing?" "Because, little brother," I thought, "my whole life with this family has been a whole thing, and I'm finally going to make it count." Out loud, I just smiled and walked him to the door. After he left, I sat down and laid it out cold. The company was a tower of debt balanced on one project. That project's legality balanced on one advisor's certification. And the advisor was me, alive, awake, and done being the costly one. It was almost 3 weeks after the accident before the doctor cleared me to drive. And the first place I went was Anchor's Edge. I needed to see it with my own eyes. I parked across the street and walked the perimeter slow, hand on the chain-link fence, and the smell hit me before anything else. Salt and diesel, thick in the air, the same smell that raised me, except this time it didn't comfort me. This time it felt like a lie told in a language I loved. Because the refit crew working that site were good men. I watched a guy my father's age measure twice and weld once. Careful, proud, no idea his paycheck was writing on forged paper. 40 families. That's what the salt and diesel meant now. 40 people who'd done nothing wrong, standing on top of whatever my father had buried in those contracts. And then I saw the banner. It was rolled and leaning against the construction trailer, half unfurled, gold letters on navy, grand opening, Anchor's Edge. There were folding chairs stacked nearby and a podium under a tarp. My father was throwing a dedication ceremony. Of course he was. A man like Alistair Vance doesn't just finish a marina. He stages a coronation. The mayor and the bank and the local paper all gathered to watch him be the success he'd always told the yacht club he was. I stood there in the diesel smell with my hand on a chain-link fence and felt the shape of the whole thing click into place. He had a stage already built. He'd sent the invitations. He just didn't know who else was going to be in the audience or what she'd be holding when the music stopped. The folder was still in the hospital property room. I'd have forgotten it in the fog of recovery. But driving home from the site, it surfaced like a splinter. The folder for my passenger seat, the one I'd packed the morning of the accident to reconcile against county records. The hospital had bagged my personal effects and never returned them, because no one had claimed them. My family, busy planning my funeral, hadn't bothered. I drove straight to the hospital and signed for my own property, like a stranger collecting a dead woman's things. In the parking lot, I opened the bag with hands that weren't quite steady. My phone dead, my wallet, and the folder creased but intact. Inside were the documents I'd pulled before the crash, my handwritten notes still in the margins. There was a printout of the Anchor's Edge loan guarantee submittal as it stood that morning, an earlier revision I'd grabbed from the firm's shared drive because something in it had already bothered me. There was no forged stamp on this one. It was a working set, the version that existed before they decided I wasn't coming back to sign anything. Holding it, I understood I had something they didn't know existed. A dated pre-accident snapshot of the truth. The baseline. Whatever they'd issued in my name while I was unconscious, I could lay it beside this and prove what it had looked like before they got to it. I sat in that parking lot and didn't move for a long time, the folder open in my lap, already knowing exactly what I'd have to pull next. The state keeps the issued submittal of record on file, and Leo, the same registrar who tipped me off, had no reason not to send a copy to the financial advisor whose name was sitting right on it. I asked. He emailed it within the hour, never guessing he was handing me the rope. Back home, I printed the cover sheet of what had actually been issued. It was dated 3 days into my coma. My seal sat in the corner of a document package I had never opened, inked onto paper while I was on a ventilator, and my father was telling a surgeon to let me go to save money. Someone in his office had pressed a counterfeit version of my professional life onto that page, keeping the lie alive because the lie was worth more to them than I was. I'm trained to spot what's wrong with a thing that looks right. So, I studied that stamp the way I'd study a hull that didn't pencil out. And I found it. My real seal, the embosser in my desk drawer, renders my certification number with a particular spacing. The kind of small fingerprint you stop noticing on your own work. The stamp on this cover sheet was close. Close enough to fool Leo. Close enough to fool the state. Close enough to fool a bank. But the certification number's third digit sat a hair too tight against the fourth. A flaw my Real die would never make. It was a copy. A rubber facsimile someone had ordered, probably online, off an image of one of my old genuine stamps. The forgery was decent. It just wasn't mine. And I could prove it wasn't mine because the original die that made the real ones was sitting in a locked drawer 30 minutes away that no one but me had touched. I laid the forged sheet next to a sheet I'd legitimately stamped 2 years back and beside the unsigned baseline for my folder and under a desk lamp. The difference was undeniable. My mother's voice came to me then unbidden. The wedding, the soft laugh, the whole table chuckling. She was always the costly one. I understood it completely now. In a way, 19-year-old me never could. To this family, I had never been a daughter with a face. I'd been a cost on one ledger and a signature on another. And when the costs got too high, they tried to erase the daughter while keeping the signature. They wanted my name without me attached to it. Sitting at that desk with the proof spread out and one truth, I decided they were about to get exactly the opposite. I needed to know who pressed the stamp, not to confront them, but to understand the machine. A few careful calls to people who still liked me at the firm gave me the picture. A junior clerk named Liam, 23, had been processing the Anchor's Edge loan guarantees for months on my father's direct instruction using a seal he'd been handed and told was authorized. Liam thought he was doing his job. The forged closeout confirmations I'd been fed, the ones claiming a different financial advisor was handling the project. Those had come from my father's desk to keep me looking the wrong way. That's the detail that matters.
And it's why none of this is on me.
My father didn't gamble that I wouldn't notice. He engineered it so I couldn't. He kept me away from the state office, fed me forged paper that said everything was fine, and ran a duplicate seal through a kid who didn't know better. I'd asked the right questions. I'd been handed manufactured answers. Now, here's where most people would call their father and scream. And I want to be honest about why I didn't. I'm a maritime surveyor. When a vessel is failing, you don't stand under it shouting. You find the load-bearing element, the single point holding the whole flawed thing up. And you understand exactly what happens when it's removed. My father had spent 4 years making my certification the load-bearing element of his entire company. He'd just spent 3 days proving he'd kill me to keep using it. I was about to do something he'd never see coming because it had never occurred to him that the load-bearing element might choose to step aside. If you keep your own receipts, if you're the careful one in your family, you can already feel where this goes. Subscribe so you're here when it lands. It lands hard. So I mapped the load path the way I would for any failing vessel. And what I drew on a legal pad at my kitchen table was the most beautiful diagram I've ever made. It went like this. A valid marine project contract depends on a valid certified financial advisor of record. The project surety bond depends on those contracts holding up. And the bank's construction financing, the one carrying my father's entire over-leveraged company, carried covenants requiring the bond to stay in good standing. On most jobs, there'd be slack in that chain. Cure periods, time to name a replacement advisor, room to fix a paperwork gap before anyone pulled a trigger. But this wasn't a paperwork gap. The moment I reported the seal was forged, my stepping away stopped being a routine vacancy and became evidence of possible fraud. And fraud doesn't get a cure period. It gets an investigation. And investigations freeze everything they touch. Add to that how tightly my father had leveraged Anchor's Edge. Every covenant drawn close because he'd borrowed against the last inch of the project and the slack was gone. Pull out the bottom block and the tower doesn't lean. It comes down. And the bottom block, the single element every other piece was resting on, was me. Not Marcus, not my father, not the mayor he'd invited to cut the ribbon. Me, the costly one, the one they'd tried to let go to save a few $100,000 on a surgery, never grasping that the same signature they'd forged to keep their marina legal was the signature that could unbuild everything they owned with one honest, properly filed piece of paper. I sat with that pad for an hour. I want to be clear that I felt no joy in it. Not yet. Only a cold, professional clarity, the same focus I get when a calculation finally closes. My father had taught me, without meaning to, the most important lesson of my career. Never put your whole company on a foundation you don't actually control. He'd built his life on my name, assuming the name would always be too dutiful, too quiet, too cheap to itself to ever object. He'd misread the structure. The load-bearing element was awake now, and it had spent its whole life learning, in precise legal and marine engineering terms, exactly how to fail on command. I didn't do it alone, and I didn't do it hot. I took my legal pad and my folder and the 2 stamps to Karen Vogel, an attorney I'd met years earlier reviewing a contract, a sharp, unhurried woman who charged by the hour and was worth every minute. I laid it all out on her conference table and watched her read. And when she finished, she took off her glasses and looked at me with something like respect. "Let me make sure I understand the position you're in," she said. "You are the financial advisor of record. You have a withdrawal request that's been improperly stalled, and someone has been forging your seal on active loan guarantee submittals while you were medically incapacitated." I nodded. All 3. She walked me through it carefully, with the hedges a good lawyer always uses. I had the right to formally withdraw as financial advisor of record through the proper channel, notifying the licensing board, the surety, and the project owner. I likely had a professional and ethical obligation to report the forged seal to the state board. And once a project that size lost its financial advisor of record and its bond came under review, she said, the financial dominoes were not something I would be causing so much as something I would be declining to keep holding up. "There's a difference, Elara," Karen said, "between knocking a vessel down and refusing to keep standing inside it, holding up the hull with your bare hands." I told her I'd been holding up that hull my whole life. She smiled just slightly. "Then let's file the paperwork that lets you put your arms down." It was, I realized, the first time in 30 years that someone had treated my name as something that belonged to me. My father came to my condo the night before everything was filed, and for about 4 minutes he was almost human. He looked old in my doorway, smaller than the man in the hospital bouquet, and he sat heavily on my couch and told me a story I'd never heard. 9 years ago, a charter boat his crew had refitted sank in a sudden squall. A family of 4 lost everything, though thankfully no lives were lost. The investigation found the refit was done improperly, and my father lost his main certification over it, and nearly lost the company and spent 2 years certain he'd lose the house and the name and everything that made him Alistair Vance in this town. "I built it all back," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I'd never heard. "From nothing. I couldn't lose it again. I just couldn't." And for one breath I felt it, the pull of the wound under the monster. The fear that had been driving him all these years. I almost reached for him. Then he wiped his face and rebuilt himself in front of me. And the human thing curdled back into what it really was. "So don't blow this up over hurt feelings," he said. "Steady now. Reasonable, lethal. What's done is done. The surgery, the order, all of it. That was a terrible moment, but it made sense at the time. I'd have paid if it made sense. It didn't. There it was again. The second time I'd heard the math from his own mouth. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." I'd have paid if it made sense. He'd have spent money to keep me alive if the numbers had justified it, and they hadn't. And he still, sitting in my living room, believed that was a defensible position. The 4 minutes of almost human died, right there on my couch. He hadn't come to apologize. He'd come to talk me out of mattering. I walked him to the door, and I thanked him for telling me about the boat. And I meant it because it was the last piece I needed. I could have just walked away. That's what the old me would have done. The quiet one, the one who absorbed costs so no one had to hear about them. I could have let my withdrawal grind through its stalled channel, kept my head down, and let my father's house of cards fall on its own schedule years from now with me long gone from it. Walking away in silence is its own kind of revenge, and I understand why people choose it. But silence is what my whole family had counted on for me for 30 years. Silence is what let them forge my name in the first place. They'd built their entire scheme on the assumption that the costly one would always be too well behaved to make a sound. So I made a different choice. And I want to be honest that it was a choice. Mine made it a kitchen table with a cold cup of tea, not something that happened to me. I would not just withdraw. I would withdraw correctly on the record. And I would report the forged seal to the state board, also on the record, because that part wasn't revenge. It was the law, and my certification demanded it. The truth filed properly, in the right order, on the right morning. And the right morning, I decided, was obvious. He'd built a stage. He'd invited the mayor, the bank, the press, the whole town that thought Alistair Vance was a self-made saint. He wanted an audience for his coronation.
Fine.
I'm not a cruel person, and I take no pride in humiliation for its own sake. But if a man insists on gathering every person whose opinion he's ever cared about, the kindest thing you can do is make sure the truth arrives while they're all still seated. Karen and I built it like a demolition sequence, which is to say carefully, legally, and timed to the second. For things would go out, all dated to take effect the morning of the annual Marine Industry Gala and dedication. A formal withdrawal of my engagement as a financial advisor of record delivered to the state licensing board, the project owner, and the firm. A notice to the surety company that the project no longer had a valid financial advisor of record, copied to the bank that held the construction financing. A complaint to the Florida Department of Marine Commerce reporting the forged seal with my 2 stamps and the dated submittal as exhibits. And a short, factual cover letter. No adjectives, no anger, just dates and facts and certification numbers. The most devastating things I own. Karen reviewed every word twice. The night before, I sat at my desk assembling the envelopes, and I took the crimson wristband out of the drawer where I'd kept it since Sophia handed it to me. I set it on the desk next to the sealed letters, and I looked at it for a while. They'd put that band on me to mark me as someone not worth saving. It had cost them nothing to write me off. It was going to cost them everything to have been wrong. I didn't feel rage holding it. I felt the opposite of rage, a kind of settled quiet. The calm you get when a long calculation finally balances. I slid the band back in the drawer, sealed the last envelope, and went to bed and slept better than I had in years. Karen would send everything at 8 the next morning, hours before the noon ceremony. So the surety, the bank, and the board would already be reading by the time my father reached for his scissors. I just had to be there to watch. 5 weeks after my father told a doctor to let me die, Vance Marine Holdings threw a dedication ceremony for Anchor's Edge, and it was everything he'd dreamed. They'd set up rows of white folding chairs on the newly paved dock, a podium with a company logo, a long gold ribbon strung across the marina entrance, and the big shears on a velvet cushion like a crown. The mayor came. A man from the bank came in a good suit, and a woman I recognized as the surety company's regional rep stood near the back, checking her phone. A reporter and photographer from the county paper worked the small crowd. My father held court at the center of it, shaking hands, his laugh carrying, my mother beside him in pearls. Marcus trailing with a tray of little plastic champagne flutes. They looked like the family they'd always advertised. I arrived a few minutes before it started and stood at the edge of the crowd near the back in a plain navy dress holding nothing but my phone. No one paid attention to me, which was the point. My father caught my eye once across the crowd, and his face did a complicated thing. Surprise, then a quick recalculation, then a politician smile, as if my showing up was a sign I'd come around. He gave me a small nod, the nod of a man who thinks he's won. I nodded back. Then the mayor stepped to the podium and said a few words about local business and the backbone of the community. And my father stepped up beside the gold ribbon, beaming, and lifted the big ceremonial shears. The photographer raised his camera, and in 4 different offices across 2 counties, the filings Karen had sent at 8 that morning had already been read, and the people who needed to act on them had quietly started to move. Lessons from this story. Deceitful foundations, no matter how elaborate, will eventually collapse. Never let others define your worth, especially if they see you as a mere cost. Betrayal and unethical actions, particularly by those closest, carry severe consequences. Meticulous record-keeping and understanding legal processes are powerful tools for justice.